When lives are on the line, hesitation is not an option and every second matters. This footage contains no staged scenarios and absolutely no camera tricks. You are about to experience the absolute, raw truth.
Warrant to search this property, step aside.
Okay, then show me the warrant.
We don't have to show you anything. We're executing a lawful search.
Actually, under the Fourth Amendment, you're required to present the warrant before entry.
Lady, you're interfering with a police investigation. That's a crime.
And conducting a warrantless search is a constitutional violation. That's a law.
At exactly 7:15 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Philadelphia, 3 police officers thought they were about to execute a routine drug raid. What they didn't know was that they had just knocked on the door of someone who had sent 14 corrupt cops to federal prison in the past 3 years. The woman standing in that doorway wasn't going to be intimidated by badges or threats. She was someone who understood power better than they did. She knew the law better than their entire department. And in the next 23 minutes, she was going to dismantle everything they thought they knew about getting away with illegal searches. Before we continue, where are you watching from right now? Drop your country or state in the comments. And if you haven't already subscribed, hit that button now because this story gets absolutely wild. Jasmine Carter was not your average 29-year-old black woman. While most people her age were still paying off student loans and figuring out their careers, Jasmine had already become one of the most feared federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. She wasn't just good at her job, she was legendary. As a black woman who had grown up watching her father get pulled over repeatedly for driving while black, Jasmine had personal reasons for choosing her career path. She knew what it felt like to watch authority figures abuse their power. She had decided early on that she would become someone who could fight back with the full force of the law. Jasmine had graduated from Stanford Law School with honors. She had clerked for a federal appellate judge who specialized in criminal procedure. Then she had done something that most young lawyers considered career suicide. She had turned down high-paying offers from major law firms to take a job at the U.S. Attorney's office, making a fraction of the salary. Why? Because Jasmine didn't want to defend corporations. She wanted to prosecute criminals. Specifically, she wanted to prosecute criminals who wore badges. She had joined the Public Corruption Unit, a specialized division that investigated and prosecuted government officials who abused their power. For the past 3 years, she had focused almost exclusively on police misconduct, civil rights violations, illegal searches, evidence planting, excessive force, false testimony. The cases that made other prosecutors nervous, Jasmine took eagerly. She had a conviction rate of 87%, which was unheard of in public corruption cases. She had secured prison sentences totaling over 200 years for officers who thought they were above the law. She had testified before Congress about police accountability. She had written a law review article that changed how federal courts evaluated qualified immunity defenses. Defense attorneys hated her. Police unions called her biased and anti-cop. Internal affairs divisions both feared and respected her, because when Jasmine Carter opened an investigation, people went to prison. But here's what made Jasmine truly dangerous to corrupt officers. She didn't just know criminal law and constitutional law. She knew police procedure better than most cops. She had spent hundreds of hours riding along with officers, watching how they worked, learning their tactics, understanding their culture. She had reviewed thousands of police reports, body camera videos, and arrest records. She could spot a falsified warrant application from a mile away. She could identify Fourth Amendment violations that other prosecutors missed. She knew the difference between legitimate police work and criminals with badges. And she specialized in one particular type of case: illegal searches based on false or non-existent warrants. It was a tactic used by certain officers who wanted to make arrests and seizures without going through the hassle of actually establishing probable cause. They would either fabricate information on warrant applications, or they would conduct searches without warrants and claim exigent circumstances that didn't exist. Jasmine had prosecuted 11 cases involving warrant fraud in the past 2 years. She had a 100% conviction rate on those cases. Officers who lied on warrant applications went to federal prison when Jasmine Carter was prosecuting. And on that Saturday morning, 3 officers from the Philadelphia Police Department's narcotics unit were about to learn why. Jasmine lived in a converted warehouse in a transitioning neighborhood. The area had been industrial 20 years ago, but now it was filling up with artists, young professionals, and small businesses. Jasmine had bought the place 3 years earlier because she liked the space and the location was convenient to the federal courthouse. The building had 2 units. Jasmine lived in the upstairs loft. The downstairs unit was rented by a graphic designer named James Torres. James was 31. Originally from Puerto Rico, quiet, kept to himself, paid his rent on time, and minded his own business. Jasmine didn't know him well. They exchanged pleasantries when they ran into each other. He had helped her carry groceries up the stairs once. She had signed for a package for him. Normal neighbor stuff. What Jasmine definitely didn't know was that James had a brother who was involved in drug dealing. Not James himself. James was completely clean. But his brother Carlos had gotten into some trouble, and Philadelphia PD's narcotics unit had been investigating Carlos for months. The officers had been surveilling Carlos, tracking his movements, trying to build a case. During that surveillance, they had seen Carlos visit the building where James lived. They had seen him go inside and come out 20 minutes later carrying a gym bag. That was enough, in their minds, to assume that drugs were being stored in that building. They didn't know which unit. They didn't have any actual evidence of drugs. They just had an assumption based on one visit by a suspected dealer. So they did what they had done dozens of times before. They wrote up a warrant application filled with exaggerations and assumptions presented as facts. They claimed they had reliable confidential informant information, which they didn't. They claimed they had observed multiple suspicious visits when they had only seen one. They claimed they had corroborating evidence of drug dealing at that address, which didn't exist. They submitted the application to a magistrate judge on a Friday afternoon, when judges were rushing through paperwork to get home for the weekend. The judge, not reading carefully, signed the warrant. The warrant was for the entire building, both units, even though the officers only suspected activity in one unit and didn't even know which one. That Saturday morning, officers Derek Mullins, Chris Santos, and Rebecca Walsh showed up to execute the warrant. Derek was the lead officer, 42 years old, 15 years on the force. Chris and Rebecca were younger, less experienced, but they followed Derek's lead. Derek had been investigated twice before for questionable search tactics. Both times, internal affairs had cleared him, not because he was innocent, but because the cases were closed before anyone looked too closely. They knocked on the main door at 7:15 a.m. Jasmine was awake. She had been out for a run, had showered, and was making coffee when she heard the pounding. She went to the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, hair still wet, her brown skin visible through the door's window. Through the door, she could see 3 people in tactical gear with police printed on their vests. She opened the door with the chain still on. Derek Mullins saw a young black woman in casual clothes and made his first assumption of many he would regret that morning. That's when Derek said they had a warrant and told her to step aside. Jasmine's response was immediate and precise. She demanded to see the warrant. Not requested, demanded. Derek tried the authority play, telling her they didn't have to show her anything. It was a lie, and Jasmine knew it instantly. She cited the 4th Amendment, the requirement to present the warrant before entry. This wasn't law school theory. This was settled constitutional law. Any officer who had been through basic training should have known this. Derek escalated. He accused her of interfering, calling it a crime. He was trying to intimidate her into backing down through the threat of arrest. Jasmine didn't back down. She called out his violation as what it was, a constitutional violation that would result in a lawsuit. Then she dropped the question again. The one question Derek couldn't answer with anything other than the truth. That's when Derek made his fatal mistake. Instead of answering the question, he challenged her authority. Who the hell did she think she was? Jasmine told him exactly who she was. An assistant United States attorney who prosecuted corrupt police officers for a living. And she told him something that should have made all 3 officers immediately walk away and call their supervisor. She told them that if they entered without showing a valid warrant, she would have federal charges filed against them by Monday morning. Not a threat, a promise. Backed by the full weight of the United States Department of Justice, quick question for you watching. Have you ever wondered what happens when police meet someone who actually has the power to prosecute them? Drop a comment below. Derek froze. He looked at Chris and Rebecca. You could see the calculation happening. Were they really going to walk away from a search because someone was questioning them? Derek pulled out a folded document from his pocket. He held it up for Jasmine to see through the crack in the door. Jasmine told him to slide it under the door so she could read it properly. Derek hesitated, then did. Jasmine picked up the document and read it carefully, every single line. The whole time, the 3 officers stood in the hallway, waiting. It took her about 2 minutes. 2 minutes where she was analyzing every word, every date, every piece of probable cause listed in the warrant application. When she looked up, her expression had changed. She wasn't just asserting her rights anymore. She was seeing evidence of a crime. Jasmine opened the door fully. She stepped into the hallway holding the warrant, and she started asking questions that made Derek's face go pale. She asked who the confidential informant was, who had allegedly provided information about drug activity at this address. Derek said he couldn't reveal that. Jasmine said that was fine. She would subpoena the CI's identity in federal court, and they both knew what would happen when no CI existed. She asked about the alleged multiple controlled buys that the warrant claimed had occurred at this location. When were they? What dates? What times? What amounts? Derek said that information was in the case file. Jasmine said she wanted the case number so she could review the file. Derek gave her a number. She asked which unit they were actually searching. Derek said both. Jasmine asked why both units when they had no specific information about either unit. Derek said the warrant covered the whole building. Jasmine pointed out that a warrant has to be specific about the place to be searched, and searching an entire building when you only have suspicion about one unidentified unit was a general warrant prohibited by the Fourth Amendment. Derek was sweating now, not from heat, from pressure. Jasmine asked one more question. She asked if the magistrate judge who signed this warrant was Judge Patricia Morrison. Derek looked at the warrant and confirmed that yes, it was Judge Morrison. Jasmine smiled, not a happy smile, a smile that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. She told the officers that she knew Judge Morrison personally. That Judge Morrison was extremely careful about warrant applications and would not have signed off on a warrant this sloppy unless someone had misrepresented the facts to her. She told them that she would be visiting Judge Morrison first thing Monday morning with this warrant and would be asking very specific questions about what they had represented to her. Then Jasmine asked a question that ended everything. She asked if this warrant had been obtained by Detective Derek Mullins. Derek confirmed he was Derek Mullins. Jasmine asked if he was the same Derek Mullins who had been investigated twice before by Internal Affairs for questionable search warrants. The silence was deafening. Jasmine told them they had two choices. They could walk away right now. She would file a complaint with their department and with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and there would be an investigation. Or they could try to execute this clearly defective warrant, and she would personally ensure that federal criminal charges were filed for deprivation of rights under color of law, which carried a maximum sentence of 10 years. She told them to choose carefully and choose quickly. Chris and Rebecca looked at Derek. Derek looked at the warrant in Jasmine's hands. Then he looked at the door behind her, knowing that whatever they might find inside wouldn't be worth federal prison. Derek made the smart choice for the first and possibly only time that morning. He told his team they were leaving. Jasmine said she would keep the original warrant as evidence. Derek tried to argue that they needed it. Jasmine reminded him that, as a federal prosecutor, she was seizing it as evidence of a potential federal crime. She suggested he have his sergeant contact her office if he had any questions about that. The three officers left. Jasmine closed the door, went back inside, and made a phone call to her supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Then she made another call to the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force. Then she made a third call to Internal Affairs at Philadelphia PD. By 8 a.m., 3 different investigations had been opened into Derek Mullins and his warrant application. By Monday morning, Derek had been placed on administrative leave. His warrant applications for the past 2 years were being reviewed by a team of federal agents and prosecutors. By Wednesday, the FBI had interviewed Judge Morrison, who was furious when she learned how her trust had been exploited. She provided a statement detailing what Derek had represented to her versus what was actually in the warrant application. By Friday, Derek Mullins was arrested on federal charges: 2 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, 1 count of perjury in warrant application. Each count carried a potential 10-year sentence. Chris Santos and Rebecca Walsh were not charged criminally, but they were both suspended pending investigation. They ultimately resigned before the investigation concluded. The investigation didn't stop with Derek. Federal agents started pulling all the warrant applications from the narcotics unit for the past 3 years. They found a pattern: exaggerated probable cause, fabricated confidential informant information, vague descriptions of criminal activity, general warrants that violated the particularity requirement. They found 27 warrants that had similar problems to the one Derek had tried to execute at Jasmine's building. 27 potentially illegal searches. 27 cases that might have involved constitutional violations. Do you think entire police units should be held accountable when they have patterns like this? Let me know in the comments. Jasmine was assigned as the lead prosecutor on the case. She recused herself from being a witness since she was involved in the incident, but she could still prosecute the broader pattern of misconduct that the investigation had uncovered. The case took 9 months to build. Jasmine's team interviewed dozens of people who had been subject to searches by Derek's unit. They reviewed hundreds of warrant applications. They identified 12 other officers who had been involved in the questionable warrants. The scope expanded beyond just Derek Mullins. The entire narcotics unit was under investigation. The unit's supervisor, Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, was found to have approved many of the problematic warrants without adequate review. He was charged as well. Derek went to trial. He claimed he had acted in good faith, that he had genuinely believed there was probable cause, that any errors were honest mistakes. Jasmine dismantled his defense methodically. She showed the jury 12 different warrant applications where Derek had used nearly identical language to describe different confidential informants who allegedly didn't exist. She showed them how Derek's warrants always seemed to get approved on Friday afternoons when judges were busy. She showed them a pattern of targets being predominantly Black and Latino residents in specific neighborhoods. She called witnesses who testified about how Derek's team had entered their homes, found nothing, and left without apology. Most of those witnesses were Black and Latino residents who lived in neighborhoods that Derek's unit targeted disproportionately. She called a retired magistrate judge who explained exactly what information judges rely on when approving warrants, and how Derek's misrepresentations had corrupted that process. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Derek Mullins guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. His conviction made headlines across Philadelphia. The U.S. attorney held a press conference where she specifically mentioned that the case had been initiated because one of her prosecutors had personally witnessed an illegal search attempt. The coverage identified Jasmine as that prosecutor. Within 24 hours, she received death threats from police supporters, many of them explicitly racist, targeting her as a Black woman who dared to prosecute white officers. She also received hundreds of emails from people thanking her for standing up to corruption, many from Black and brown families who had been victims of similar illegal searches. The investigation into the narcotics unit continued. 3 more officers were charged federally. 8 others were fired by the department. Lieutenant Brennan pleaded guilty to conspiracy to violate civil rights and received 5 years. The Philadelphia Police Department was forced to implement sweeping reforms. Every warrant application now required review by a legal advisor before submission. All officers had to complete a 40-hour course on Fourth Amendment requirements. Body cameras became mandatory for all search warrant executions. An outside auditor was hired to review warrant applications quarterly. The district attorney's office had to review all 27 cases where illegal warrants had been used. They dismissed charges in 19 cases. 5 people who had been convicted were released from prison when their convictions were overturned. The city faced a wave of civil rights lawsuits from people who had been illegally searched. The settlements totaled over $8 million. The insurance company that covered the police department threatened to drop coverage unless serious reforms were implemented. All of this happened because Jasmine Carter refused to step aside when 3 officers showed up at her door with a defective warrant. Let's talk about the bigger picture here. This story isn't just about one prosecutor stopping one illegal search. It's about what happens when someone with actual authority challenges police who are used to being unchallengeable. Most people don't know their rights when police show up with a warrant. They don't know that the warrant has to be shown before entry. They don't know what probable cause means. They don't know that they can read the warrant carefully and ask questions. They don't know what a defective warrant looks like. Police officers count on that ignorance. Not all officers, but enough that it's a systemic problem. Officers like Derek Mullins have been getting away with sloppy, questionable, and sometimes fraudulent warrants for years because nobody pushed back effectively. But Jasmine wasn't a typical citizen. She was a federal prosecutor who specialized in this exact type of misconduct. She knew what questions to ask. She knew what red flags to look for. She knew how to analyze a warrant application and spot the lies. More importantly, she had the institutional power to actually do something about it. When she said she would file federal charges, it wasn't an empty threat. It was a promise backed by the full weight of the Department of Justice. This case also highlights a serious problem in police culture. Derek Mullins had been investigated twice before. Both investigations had cleared him, not because he was innocent, but because the system protected him. Internal affairs investigations of police misconduct have conviction rates that are dramatically lower than prosecutions of civilian crimes. Why? Because police investigate police. Because departments are more interested in protecting their officers than in accountability. Because the culture prioritizes loyalty over integrity. It took a federal investigation, led by a prosecutor who wasn't part of that culture, to finally hold Derek accountable. And even then, it only happened because he made the mistake of targeting someone who could fight back. Here's a question for you. Should all police misconduct investigations be handled by outside agencies instead of internal affairs? Comment below. The body camera footage from Derek's team that morning would later become evidence in the case. It captured Derek's initial aggression. It captured his refusal to show the warrant. It captured the moment Jasmine identified herself as a federal prosecutor. It captured Derek's face when he realized he had just tried to execute a questionable warrant on someone who could destroy his career. That footage was shown to every officer in the Philadelphia Police Department as part of the mandatory training that followed the scandal. It was titled Constitutional Requirements for Search Warrants, a Case Study. The video was meant to teach two lessons. First, know the law and follow it. Second, every person you encounter might be someone who knows their rights better than you do, and if you're cutting corners, you will eventually get caught. Jasmine continued her work at the U.S. Attorney's Office. After the Mullins case, her caseload increased dramatically. People who had been victims of police misconduct now knew there was a prosecutor who would actually pursue these cases aggressively. She has since prosecuted 23 additional officers for various forms of corruption. Her conviction rate remains above 85%. She has expanded her focus to include excessive force cases and evidence planting. She still lives in the same warehouse loft. The downstairs unit is now rented by a teacher. Jasmine made sure her new neighbor knew exactly what had happened with the previous incident and assured her that nothing like that would ever happen again. James Torres, the original downstairs tenant, moved out shortly after the incident, not because of anything Jasmine did, but because he was terrified that his brother's problems would follow him. Jasmine helped him get out of his lease early and wrote a reference letter for his new apartment. Derek Mullins is currently serving his sentence at a federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania. He will be eligible for release in 2029. His law enforcement career is over, his pension was forfeited, his reputation is destroyed. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan is also in federal prison. The unit he supervised was disbanded. The officers who weren't charged were reassigned to different divisions. The three officers who showed up at Jasmine's door that morning made different choices about their careers. Derek chose to continue the corrupt practices that eventually sent him to prison. Chris Santos became a private investigator. Rebecca Walsh left law enforcement entirely and now works in social services. Let's address something that came up in the coverage of this case. Some people said Jasmine should have just let them execute the warrant and then filed a complaint afterward. They said confronting armed police officers was dangerous and could have ended badly. Here's the thing. Jasmine had every legal right to demand to see the warrant before allowing entry. That's not confrontational. That's constitutional law. The Fourth Amendment specifically requires particularity in warrants, and courts have consistently held that the warrant must be shown to the person whose property is being searched. As for the danger argument, Jasmine was very aware of the risk. As a black woman, she understood that confrontations with police carried additional danger. She had prosecuted cases where confrontations with police had turned violent, disproportionately against people who looked like her. She understood that asserting your rights while black can be life-threatening. But she also understood that if she, as a black federal prosecutor with institutional power and legal knowledge, didn't assert those rights, then ordinary black citizens had no hope of doing so. Someone with her advantages had a responsibility to push back, and she calculated correctly that once she identified herself as a federal prosecutor who specialized in police corruption, the officers would realize that any violence against her would bring consequences they couldn't escape. Not everyone has that privilege, and that's exactly the problem Jasmine is trying to fix through her work. So what are the lessons here? First, know your rights regarding search warrants. Police must show you the warrant before entry. You have the right to read it carefully. You have the right to check if it's properly signed and dated. You have the right to see if it specifies your address and what they're looking for. Don't interfere with the search, but document everything. Second, stay calm and don't provide information voluntarily. Jasmine asked clear, direct questions. She didn't argue emotionally. She didn't volunteer information. She controlled the interaction through knowledge and composure. Third, document everything. If police execute a search warrant, take photos of any damage, keep copies of all paperwork, note the names and badge numbers of all officers present, and write down exactly what happened while it's fresh in your memory. Fourth, seek legal help immediately. If you believe a search was illegal, contact an attorney right away. There are strict time limits for challenging searches and preserving evidence. Fifth, understand that accountability is possible but requires follow-through. Jasmine didn't just stop the illegal search. She filed complaints with 3 different agencies. She cooperated with investigators. She prosecuted the case. She saw it through to the end. That's what creates change. As of now, Derek Mullins has 7 years left on his sentence. He filed an appeal arguing that his conviction was unfair because the prosecutor had been personally involved in the case. The appeal was denied. Jasmine Carter was promoted to senior trial attorney in the Public Corruption Unit. She now supervises other prosecutors working on police misconduct cases. She has trained FBI agents on how to identify warrant fraud. She lectures at law schools about federal prosecution of civil rights violations. The Philadelphia Police Department still operates under the consent decree requiring outside review of warrant applications. Compliance has been mixed. Some officers embrace the reforms, others resist them. The audits have found continued problems, though not as severe as during the Derek Mullins era. None of these changes would have happened if Jasmine had stepped aside that Saturday morning. None of them would have happened if she had let the illegal search proceed and filed a complaint later. None of them would have happened if she hadn't known her rights and had the power to enforce them. One prosecutor, one illegal warrant, 23 minutes at her front door, and an entire police unit was dismantled. That's the power of knowledge combined with institutional authority. That's what accountability looks like when someone with the ability to enforce it refuses to look away. That's what happens when corrupt officers finally encounter someone they can't intimidate. Final question for you. What's one thing you learned from this story that you didn't know before? Drop your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. This story matters because it reveals how police corruption thrives. Not through dramatic Hollywood-style crime, but through routine corner cutting and assumptions that nobody will push back. Through warrant applications that exaggerate facts because judges are too busy to scrutinize them carefully. Through supervisors who approve questionable tactics because questioning officers is uncomfortable. Jasmine's story shows that these systems can be challenged, that corrupt officers can be prosecuted, that entire units can be held accountable when patterns of misconduct are exposed. That change is possible when someone with knowledge and authority refuses to accept business as usual. Not every illegal search gets stopped. Not every corrupt officer goes to prison. Not every victim has access to justice. But this one did, and that matters. The warrant application that Derek Mullins submitted that Friday afternoon is now used in law schools as an example of probable cause fraud. You can see where he claimed facts that didn't exist. You can see where he exaggerated suspicious activity. You can see exactly what warrant fraud looks like. And maybe, just maybe, the next time an officer thinks about cutting corners on a warrant application, they'll remember this case. They'll remember Derek Mullins serving 8 years in federal prison. They'll remember that the person whose door they knock on might be someone who knows the law better than they do. That's Jasmine's legacy. Not just prosecuting one corrupt cop, but showing that the system can work when people with power use it properly. That accountability is real when someone enforces it. That rights matter when someone defends them. This is a story of how an assistant United States attorney turned an attempted illegal search into federal prison sentences for multiple officers and systemic reform for an entire police department. But more than that, it's a story about courage, knowledge, and the ongoing fight against corruption in law enforcement. Thanks for watching this story all the way through. If you found this eye-opening, make sure you're subscribed because I cover more stories like this that need to be told. Drop a comment letting me know what you think should happen in cases like these. See you in the next one.
Hidden behind the lens and resting just across the battle lines of history, these remarkable stories demand to be heard. Join us as we examine the critical turning points that changed everything.